I'm on record as saying that my red line was drawn far short of actual genocide. I'm happy to see many of the people who argued with me about voting for Biden in 2020 now on board because of this genocide. I wish it didn't take a genocide for us to hold our elected leaders accountable to addressing the substantive needs of people suffering in America in addition to the rest of the world. But I am glad we're all here now together. And I'm very interested to see what Biden says tonight in the State of the Union and whether or not there's any more substantive movement on this issue as it becomes increasingly clear that he very well may lose the presidency over this, and it would be very deserved in my humble opinion. But look, I've had you here already for half an hour, and we have not gotten to this question of the most recent round of reporting on the allegations of sexual assault on October 7th. Now, I want to start by asking the question why, and you alluded to this a little bit when we first started, but why it is that this particular claim, given there's many other, frankly, human tragedies that you can point to on October 7th, atrocities were committed as how Norm Finkelstein puts it, without having to fabricate anything or embellish anything at all. But I think we got some insight into this with this poll that came out from Frank Luntz about what kind of messaging is actually most influential to the observing ear, the American ear. Did you see this?
I did, yes.
So the question that was asked was, which bothers you more? That Hamas, and then there's a bunch of options: raped civilians, massacred civilians, bound and burned civilians, slaughtered civilians, butchered civilians, murdered civilians, executed civilians, etc. And the number one at 31% is raped civilians.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems pretty clear that there is an investment, a messaging directive in pointing to a specific kind of aggression that is alleged to have happened on October 7th instead of the other kinds, which are much more easy to substantiate, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, it's, remember right after October 7th, they started pushing this line, Hamas equals ISIS. And Hamas is not ISIS and not like ISIS. And Hamas and ISIS are enemies and ideologically completely different. It's like saying that Jerry Falwell and the Quakers are the same because, or Jerry Falwell and I don't know what are the same because they all fall within the broad realm of Christianity. I mean, maybe that's not a perfect analogy. The Quakers don't use armed struggle, whereas the Hamas does. But the point I'm making is that they're working on an idea that, these are all Muslims and they're all equally bad. And that's the sort of the already the US population they think is already primed for this message. And so you need something truly heinous. And remember the historical context here, that this charge of rape has always been used against Black people, against brown people, against colonized people. What was the accusation against Emmett Till? That he looked at a white woman. And we know that claims that settler women or white women were raped was often the pretext for lynching. And we saw this also in apartheid South Africa. And so it's a very old trope in settler colonies and in colonial situations. It has that power, and it's based on, and it's convincing to a population which is already primed with the idea that these people are brutes, these people are savages, they're not like us, they're a danger to us. So that's the context for this claim. And it is a powerful claim from Israel's perspective, because it's rooted in that, number one, which is an old racist colonial sensibility, but they also hope to root it in a more sort of contemporary and progressive sensibility about, quote unquote, believe women. And so we've actually seen them trying to promote the hashtag believe Israeli women. Except the problem here is there are no Israeli women to believe, because to this day, not a single person has come forward and said, I was a victim of this. And not a single person who was killed on October 7th has been positively identified as a victim of this. And remember, their claim is a very big one. They're not saying, oh, there were a couple of sexual assaults or rapes on October 7th. That's not the claim. The claim is this was systematic. It was a weapon of war, as Hillary Clinton has put it. It was an order that they should go out and rape as many people as possible, women and men. And yet, remarkably, Israel claims they have 100,000, something like 100,000 video clips from October 7th. That includes surveillance footage. It includes cell phone videos from people. It includes overhead video from drones and helicopters. It includes GoPro videos from Palestinian fighters, some of whom were wearing cameras and would have been killed or captured that day. And Israel does not claim that a single video clip shows one of these sexual assaults that was supposedly systematic taking place. And even the UN report that just came out, which, by the way, did not do any original research or investigation and is largely a regurgitation of the same old claims repackaged under a UN logo, they say we examined video evidence and photographic evidence and could not substantiate a single claim of rape. So
let's get into that report in some more detail. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's, yeah.
Okay, so this report that was conducted by Pramila Patten. She's an Undersecretary General. She was appointed as United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict. This report is what spurred this new round of coverage in this new New York Times story. It was initially, this is one of those situations where the New York Times had to walk back its headline. It had usually used the word evidence, suggesting that there was new evidence of sexual assault on October 7th. It revised the headline to say UN team finds grounds to support reports of sexual violence and Hamas attack. And basically, I read the full report, and what she claims to have done is to visited Israel with a small team, including some more specialized experts, and over about a 2-week period, have conversations with some people, some of whom I think are completely irrelevant, like heads of state, members of government that have no firsthand knowledge of what actually happened. But then also speak to aid suppliers, what do you call them? Doctors and other first responder types.
First responders and this sort of thing, yeah.
Right, and the people at the mortuaries where bodies were taken, things like that. But very notably, and you already pointed this out, she emphasizes in the report the difficulty she had getting in contact with alleged surviving members of sexual assault.
Yeah, and nobody has positively been able to determine that there's a single such person. And again, remember, we're talking about what they claim is a systematic campaign of rape as a weapon of war. Not that there was an occasional sexual assault, but that this was systematic and widespread.
Right.
That's the claim. That's why we're supposed to care so much.
Right. And so in this report, it's fascinating because the New York Times obviously ran with this aspect where they said there was they believe that there was sexual violence. I'm like, okay, right. So let me keep reading. Clearly, you're going to show me where. I'm interested to know. I have no investment in there not being sexual violence because, as you've pointed out, even if there did emerge some proof that sexual violence occurred, it is not the story of widespread sexual violence, which was used to justify this enormously disproportionate siege on Gaza over the last 5 months. Okay. What's interesting about the report is that it emphasizes the team, it did not meet with any survivor/victim of sexual violence from October 7th, despite concerted efforts encouraging them to come forward. The rationale presented was that they are extremely traumatized. I have no doubt that victims of sexual assault are extremely traumatized, but that even under the condition of anonymity, they were unwilling to talk to a UN special representative. Now, they also allude to the fact that there is distrust of the UN because of the alleged indifference they've had to investigating these claims. Of course, Israel blocked a UN investigation of the sexual assault claims. And to the extent that there is quote unquote disinterest or a lack of investigation into substantiating them, it is largely because Israel has and seems to continue to be keeping the alleged survivors of sexual assault away from not just the public. I'm not asking them to come publicly, but even to a trusted, trained individual who's trained in having sensitive conversations about sexual violence.
Yeah. And so it's, that was a novel excuse that Israelis don't trust the UN. But do Israelis not trust any of their national institutions? Because none of them have been able to positively confirm that there are any victims. There have been vague claims, and this is repeated in the UN report, that, there are some victims being treated, but they're too traumatized to come forward. But in the press conference, Pramila Patten wouldn't say where that information came from. That same claim appeared in the New York Times in the Jeffrey Gettleman piece in December, and it came from the Israeli government. And they in that case, they said, yeah, there's a couple of victims, but they have refused to come forward physically for treatment, which was odd phrasing, which suggests that nobody has actually laid eyes on them or knows that they exist. But if I can just step back and make a couple of points about this UN report that I think are important. As you pointed out, the New York Times walked back its initial headline, which talked about evidence. They walked that back. They also, in their original write-up of the report, just told an outright lie. They misquoted the report. This is something that I documented. I tweeted it at the time, and I also, of course, archived it. But they claimed that the report used the term clear and convincing evidence. That phrase does not appear in the UN report, and they removed it from the New York Times article. It uses instead the strange phrase clear and convincing information. Well, what is that? That doesn't mean anything. Have you ever heard of clear and convincing information? And it says, the report states that most of the information, clear and convincing or not, came from Israeli national institutions. So we're talking about the military, the police, the government, and it came from so-called first responders. In the photos that Israel released of Pramila Patten touring a community in the south, she was accompanied by Yossi Landau. Who is Yossi Landau? He's a senior figure in this Jewish extremist group called Zaka, which has been misrepresented in the New York Times as first responders. What they do is they actually go to crime scenes and they collect Jewish bodies and body parts for burial, which is, of course, that's important. People should be buried according to their tradition. But this is an extremist group that has been responsible for some of the most grotesque lies. Yossi Landau himself was responsible for a lie that has been thoroughly debunked, even in the Israeli press, of a pregnant woman whose belly was sliced open and the fetus taken out and stabbed. Classic atrocity propaganda that came from Yossi Landau's own mouth, and he was the person taking Pramila Patten, the UN official, on a tour around one of these communities, the Nahal Oz kibbutz. And another crucial thing about this UN report, it's being presented, even in the walked back version, as bolstering the claims in the New York Times and in the Jeffrey Gettleman piece. But it actually debunks the Jeffrey Gettleman article even more. And I'm going to be very specific about this. Jeffrey Gettleman states in his infamous piece written with Anat Schwartz and Adam Seller about a case, again, this story was widely repeated in the media, of two teenage girls found shot and murdered together in a bedroom in Kibbutz Be'eri, another one of the settler colonies near Gaza. And that, I'm going to use the graphic language that was reported, that they were found, undressed and with semen on their bodies. The UN report that we're talking about, as flawed as it is, And as much as it tries to bolster Israel's narrative, states explicitly that the claims of sexual violence in kibbutz Be'eri are unfounded. And this particular claim was debunked back on December 1st. So we're talking December 1st in a really excellent article in Mondoweiss by a collective of Palestinian journalists. And The Intercept did its own reporting that came out just a few days ago that also quotes officials from Kibbutz Be'eri saying there is not one single founded report of sexual assault in Kibbutz Be'eri. And I'll also note that in December, a few days before the Jeffrey Gettleman article came out alleging these rapes, including in Kibbutz Be'eri, the New York Times published its own extensive article, like a deep dive into what happened in Kibbutz Be'eri, and it doesn't mention a single allegation of sexual assault. When they went to Kibbutz Be'eri, the New York Times, nobody told them about sexual assaults. There isn't a single claim there. So actually, this UN report, as flawed as it is, undermines even further the New York Times' reporting. And that's an important point to make. A couple of other quick points on the UN report, that Pramila Patten says they have no investigative mandate. They did no interviews with survivors or alleged victims. They relied almost entirely on information from so-called Israeli national institutions. So this is simply largely a recycling and regurgitation of the same claims that we have seen again and again, including in the New York Times and other media. And I think it's also important for listeners to know, when you say UN report, that sounds very authoritative. But there's UN reports and there's UN reports. And Pramila Patten is a political appointee of the Secretary General. That's in her title. She's the special representative of the Secretary General. That's one category of UN employee that is attached to the Secretary General and a political appointee. They are not independent people. On the other hand, you have independent commissions of inquiry and independent human rights experts, so-called special rapporteurs, people like Francesca Albanese. I don't know if you've had her on, but you really should try to get her.
Not yet. I'm working on it. Yeah, she's
right.
Terrific.
So Francesca Albanese is a special rapporteur who is given her mandate by the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council can also appoint a special commission of inquiry that is completely independent. They usually will appoint really prominent international figures, for example, former heads of Supreme Courts from various countries, or very prominent people. And every time Israel has gone on one of its spasms of psychotic violence in Gaza in 2008, in 2012, in 2014, in 2021, and so on, after the Great March of Return, the UN Human Rights Council has appointed an independent commission of inquiry, and Israel has utterly refused to cooperate with it. So what I would support is an independent commission of inquiry to look into these allegations, and in fact to look into everything that happened on October 7th. But of course, we're not hearing calls for that from the White House or from Israel. And of course, if it was appointed, Israel would not cooperate with it because they never have. So just because it says a UN report, people have to understand where this is coming from. This is not an independent office with real investigative powers and accountability to the Human Rights Council, where it can be examined and voted on and adopted.
Yeah, I think that your points are all excellent, but I really want to focus on the idea that reading this report actually, the things it does conclusively is disprove a number of allegations. And to the extent that it holds itself out as substantiating others, it offers no evidence, which is why I had to be removed from the title of that New York Times article. It offers no evidence.
And it doesn't use
of
the
that.
word evidence. They're careful not to use to say we see evidence. They say we see information. And what is information? What is that?
Exactly. And when you're reading it, they don't even cite who the alleged witnesses are. So part of what enabled you and Max and others to start to poke holes in that December New York Times article was that they were saying, they had direct quotes from witnesses who then you could go and look at their social media and find out that they were laughing and joking during the time when they were supposed to have been witnessing a gang rape. You could find out that they were related to the...
And
their stories changed
constantly. So, I mean, just to give you one example that was in the New York Times Jeffrey Gettleman piece, they talk about this woman called Sapir, they just give her first name, who they claim witnessed a gang rape. She says that she was shot, she was hiding in the bushes. This was at that rave that happened. And she says she sees a group of men and they get out of a van and they're raping, horrific stuff that they say. That they gang rape a woman and then they shoot her and they gang rape several other women, 5 women, and they cut off the heads of 3 of them and they're dancing around with the heads. She claims to have seen this with her own eyes. And you can't, this is a horrifying story that happened supposedly within Israeli territory. This wasn't in Gaza. It wasn't somewhere unreachable. Where are the bodies? Where are the headless bodies? Where are the heads? Where are the severed heads? Where are all the blood stains on the ground? Where is the DNA? None of that. The New York Times and this person, this Sapir, she had been telling the same story since she was introduced at an Israeli police press conference I think it was in October or early November. I think it was in mid-October, actually, where she didn't herself appear at the press conference. The Israeli police played a video of her telling this story with her appearance disguised.
Blurred. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and she also told the story of the severed heads, which most of the media did not report because I think they knew that this so undermined her credibility. Now, in the New York Times piece, there's a second witness, a man called Ura Carroll, who is supposedly hiding in the same ditch as Sapir. And in the New York Times, it says he lifted his head and he saw the rapes going on. And he's quoted in the New York Times as an eyewitness. There's a problem with this, though, which is that this same supposed eyewitness was quoted in Israeli media weeks earlier saying, I didn't see any of this. Sapir told me she saw it, but I didn't see it. Right. So what we did is we simply went back and looked at the accounts that change over time. And then there's another incident in the New York Times. So they claim 3 incidents of rape in the New York Times, 3 specific incidents. The one I just talked about, which is totally lacking in credibility and for which there's no corroborating evidence whatsoever. A second incident where the witnesses, a guy called Raz Cohen, and there's another guy whose story changed constantly. And that was some of the guys who were smiling and taking selfies and so on that you alluded to. But again, no bodies, no victims, no nothing, just their ever-changing accounts. And then the central quote-unquote victim of that story was a woman called Gal Abdush in the New York Times story, who they claim there was a video, they call it the video of the woman in the black dress, which does not show, and the New York Times does not claim that it shows Gal Abdush being sexually assaulted. They claim it shows her after she was killed in a position that suggests she might have been sexually assaulted. The problem is that as soon as the New York Times published this story, her own family came out. Her Israeli family, her sister, Miral Alta, came out and said that there is absolutely no evidence she was raped.
Right.
We've never seen any evidence. The police have never shown us any evidence she was raped. And we did not know the New York Times was going to allege any of this. And if we had known, we wouldn't have cooperated with the story. We were deceived by the New York Times, and they are now abusing Gal Abdouche to make these false claims. And
Right.
that's so there's nothing left of the New York Times story, and yet they are continuing to defend it and stand by it. And they have blood on their hands because this atrocity propaganda is being used to justify the ongoing extermination campaign in Gaza.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.